Good morning or good day, everyone. It's been a few months since I recorded last in this series where I'm reading chapters of the book I wrote on Gordon Clark, the biography. And I just checked, it was 3 months since the last one. And a few things have kept me busy in the meanwhile. 173 Appalachian Trail hikers have been over to our mission, and we had a baby boy in July, my wife and I. So we're very excited about that, of course, baby Birch, and he's doing well at home, as is my daughter Maple as well. So we have a Birch and a Maple. And I want to continue in this series here. We'll see if this video, if I can accomplish this whole chapter 4 in one recording. It's a little bit longer, I think, than some of the other chapters, but we're up now in the book to Gordon Clark at Wheaton College. And so this is a real garbage there. This is a real transition in his life, in that he's leaving Philadelphia for the first time after being born there and raised there and going to college all the way through PhD as well. Of course, he did travel some. I mean, as a child, he traveled to his family out in Western Pennsylvania, and then I'm sure he traveled other places, but in college he spent some time at Heidelberg in Germany and some time also at the Sorbonne in Paris. So it's not as if he had never traveled. But I think, actually, I don't have this in the book here on this chapter, I think Clark is taking trains back and forth from Philadelphia to Wheaton. At this time, I don't think he was driving yet. He didn't actually own a car at this point. He did, I think, when he was at Wheaton is when he first got a car, and maybe that's not too unusual in that he grew up in the city and had no real need of a car for a long time. So we will continue in the series here. I hope people find this interesting. I'd be glad for comments as well. Our Clark forums have somewhat declined in activity in recent times, but I know there's still a great interest out there. I've occasionally gathered a new letter or a new bit of information from a person about Gordon Clark, and continue to find that interesting. Maybe I'll mention one I just heard from Reverend Paul Anderson. Did I say Paul Anderson? What's his? I think I'm getting that wrong. Let me check real quick here. Paul Alexander. That's what it is. Reverend Paul Alexander, age 88, who knew Gordon Clark and was a minister in different Presbyterian denominations. And I'm working on an article, I hope anyways, that it'll come out to fruition, an article on the other BPC, which is to talk about the Columbus Synod, which is a group that became the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, which is not the same as the EPC today. The old EPC joined the RPCGS, which became the RPCES, which eventually merged into the PCA. And so I'm looking at those churches of the Columbus Synod of the Bible Presbyterian Church and where they are today. So hopefully I'll have that article sometime out this year. But I think that's my new capacity, is maybe one article a year with everything going on at church, mission, and with kids. If you haven't, do look at the article and speech I gave on John Witherspoon and the Connecting of American Presbyterians. That was something more substantial that I was able to put together. And I'm interested if you're a student of Presbyterian history, American Presbyterian history especially, and the conservatives of the 20th and 21st century, do get in touch with me and talk about your interests. Maybe it'll help me think of another article idea or something that you might be interested in writing as well. So there's a lot of good stuff there. So I continue to appreciate Wayne Sparkman at the PCA Historical Center for for his help. Okay, let's look here at chapter 4. I have another epigram. It says here, Gordon Clark quoted, "One of the best witnesses of what the Reformation taught is the Westminster Confession of 1645 to 49. Its reliability is such that thousands of ministers from that day to this have subscribed to it. The men who framed it were the most devout ministers of their day, the most competent, and the best informed on the theology of the previous century." And I've very much grown to agree with that and really like the Westminster tradition. And of course, that's our catechism and confession here in the Presbyterian Church. And we care about it here in the Bible Presbyterian Church. It's not just a document, but it's something that we actually use and read and teach. So certainly agree with it. And the purpose that I have that quote in there is we'll see that as Clark gets into hot water there at Wheaton over his strong Calvinistic views, he relies upon the fact that this was this faith of his has been around. He's not the first guy to say these things. I was thinking about the confession the other day, in that I was interacted with a Greek Orthodox priest, brief conversation, and spoke to a member of a Greek Orthodox church as well. And I had the same experience I've had at, I think, 3 times I've been to a Greek Orthodox church. And they'll always say, we're the oldest church. We've been around since 33 AD and nothing's ever changed. Of course, they had an American flag in the church, which I don't think was around in 33 AD. And there were various other practices. So age isn't everything. And the Westminster Confession, certainly that it tells us that this is a tradition of belief in the Reformed and Presbyterian faith that's been around for almost 400 years now in that codified form. But more importantly to me, as you look at the Reformation, you're coming into a period where the scriptures are being looked at without perhaps the baggage of the Middle Ages or other periods, and without being in Latin or really divorced from the people. So it's a time that they really look at the scriptures, and if the scriptures are perspicuous, as I always emphasize, I think that's one of the most important elements of the scriptures. We understand the perspicuity of them, because the scriptures are clear. When people got serious about reading and understanding the scriptures, we should expect them to come to generally similar conclusions, which we see broadly across the Reformed world. Whereas other ideas like Darbyism, the dispensationalism of Schofield and others, which emerge much later, hundreds and hundreds of years into the Christian church, but also hundreds of years after the Reformation, quite suspect just on that account that this would be a proper interpretation. And so we see the Reformed faith as elements of it there, really all the way back through church history. And I like to emphasize, I think about these things. I didn't have enough time to talk with the Greek Orthodox folks, but the Reformation is an Augustinian Reformation. We are saying much that St. Augustine said. Perhaps Calvin is stronger in some aspects, but this is not something new. And so differences between East and West, of course, go back to the time of Augustine and even earlier. So there's some of that. And I haven't even started reading yet on the chapter. So let's get in and see if I can speak without interrupting myself. Gordon Clark served as a professor of philosophy at Wheaton College for only 7 years, 1936 to 1943. His resignation in 1943 resulted from his unbending adherence to the teachings of the Westminster Confession of Faith. At Wheaton, Clark expounded theological views that irritated the college's interdenominational establishment. But despite conflicts with the administration and board of trustees, His years at Wheaton were some of his most productive. In the classroom, he exercised a profound influence on a number of future evangelical leaders. As a scholar, he wrote prolifically and sowed the seeds of many future book projects. To understand the events that unfolded during Clark's tenure at Wheaton, it is important first to understand some of the background and history of the college. Wheaton was founded in 1860 as a private Christian liberal arts college located 25 miles west of Chicago. For the first 65 years of its history, the college was blessed with the stable leadership of just two presidents: the founder of the school, Jonathan Blanchard, 1811 to 1892, and his son, Charles A. Blanchard, 1848 to 1925. The Blanchard era can be characterized as a time of moderate growth for the school, during which it was principally dedicated to opposing worldly evils, most notably slavery and intemperance. The death of the younger Blanchard in 1925 signaled the end of an era of two generations of family leadership. Around the time of Charles Blanchard's death, a visiting preacher named J. Oliver Buswell, then a pastor in New York but originally from the Midwest, gained popularity among the Wheaton students through a series of sermons at the college chapel. Admiration for Buswell led the students to petition for his return to the chapel to preach additional sermons. Recognizing the popularity of Buswell, the college offered him the job as president of the college, which he gladly accepted. That seems like an unlikely scenario in these days. Unlikely that anyone to be that popular, especially a minister, and to jump right from preaching into leading a college as requested by the students. That's a wonderful thing, but unlikely, it seems. Clark arrived at Wheaton as Buswell was busy reshaping the college. Buswell aimed to improve the school's academic standing by hiring scholars with doctorate degrees in their respective fields, a rare commodity at that time. In early 1936, when a position in the philosophy department opened up for the following school year, Buswell inquired of Clark if he would be interested in the job. Buswell knew Clark from their mutual membership and involvement in the reformed seeking Presbyterian Constitutional Covenant Union, the PCCU. The two men agreed on the need to reform the PCUSA, and both supported J. Gresham Machen, the leading voice for reform in the church. It appears, in fact, that they found commonality on many topics. They first met in person in 1935 at a gathering of church leaders, where, according to Clark, they had engaged in a stimulating discussion. With a PhD, teaching experience, and an extensive publication record, Clark was a strong candidate. Within a week of hearing from Buswell, Clark filled out an application and returned it. Meanwhile, Wheaton paid for Clark to make a guest visit to the college. During his visit, Clark gave a speech in Buswell's theism class and a devotional talk at the college chapel. Although Buswell and Clark had already begun to establish a relationship through the reform movement in the PCUSA, Clark was an unknown to others at Wheaton. After Buswell offered Clark the position at Wheaton, he questioned whether Clark would fit in at the interdenominational college. Both men wondered if Clark's theological views might create a potential impasse to his hire. Buswell was expressly concerned with Clark's unwillingness to accept the premillennial position contained in Wheaton College's Standards of Faith and Doctrinal Platform. At Buswell's suggestion, Clark took a one-year leave of absence from his lecturer position at the University of Pennsylvania, with the assurance that he could maintain his position at Penn if things did not work out at Wheaton. We'll find out later that assurance wasn't so sure, as he later is told, don't come back to Penn, or basically stay where you are at Wheaton. With the agreement in place, Clark was hired as a visiting professor at Wheaton for the 1936-37 school year. For Buswell, this one-year trial period was designed to monitor Clark with the hope that he would come to agree to Wheaton's standard premillennial position as outlined in their official statement of beliefs. The temporary nature of Clark's appointment allowed both Buswell and Clark to weigh their options with minimal risk. On March 5th, 1937, near the end of his trial year of teaching, and after much discussion, Clark and the Wheaton administration, including President J. Oliver Buswell, Vice President Enoch C. Dernis, Dean Dr. Wallace L. Emerson, and Professor Dr. Henry C. Thiessen came to a satisfactory working understanding regarding the Calvinistic problem of how the doctrine of blameworthy responsibility is safeguarded in Clarke's theology. In other words, the college accepted Clarke despite his theological views, which diverged from the majority at the college. Dr. Thiessen wanted Clarke to be blocked from teaching the doctrines of Calvinism, but Thiessen's attempt to regulate Clarke's teaching failed, and the official agreement for Clarke's hire was that nothing beyond the platform was to be required. Around this same time, Clarke and the Wheaton administration must have also reached an agreement on the topic of millennialism. Though the precise nature of this agreement is unclear, it probably was concerned with the particular distinction between the two common types of premillennialism. One form of premillennialism, a form taught by some of the ancient church fathers, was an acceptable position in some Presbyterian churches. This historic premillennialism taught, among other things, that Jesus would return to earth prior to a literal 1,000-year reign of the saints. Dispensational premillennialism, on the other hand, was a more recent interpretation, which originated in the 19th century, and which claimed that God had two distinct peoples, Israel and the church, and that God's promises of land, descendants, and blessings to Israel will be fulfilled during the future millennium of Christ's reign on earth. Most Presbyterian churches strictly opposed dispensational premillennialism. Although Clarke never embraced the dispensationalist position, his acceptance of historic premillennialism appears to have been sufficient to quell the concerns of the Wheaton College administration. After an agreement was reached on this issue, Clarke formally resigned his position at the University of Pennsylvania on July 1st, 1937, and was appointed to a permanent position as Associate Professor of Philosophy at Wheaton College. Clarke's motives for relocating to Wheaton College included his promotion to Associate Professor and the chance to work under a supportive president in Buswell. He was also eager to escape the secular environment of the University of Pennsylvania, where he felt isolated as a conservative Christian. In a letter to President Buswell in 1933, apparently a separate attempt to be considered for a position 3 years prior to Buswell's overtures to hire Clarke in 1936, Clarke stated, "To be quite honest, it was the financial conditions at this university, Penn, which prompted this letter of application to a position at Wheaton. But further reflection adds that my religious convictions would make Wheaton more agreeable than secular institutions." When first contemplating a move to Wheaton, Clarke expressed to Buswell that at Penn he felt like a lone missionary in the middle of China and wondered if perhaps he was sowing on stony ground, a reference to Jesus' parable of the sower. Financial considerations also played an important part in Clarke's decision to take the position at Wheaton. He began his teaching career at Penn with an annual salary of $2,400. Unfortunately, tightening its belt during the Great Depression, the university slashed salaries. Clarke saw his annual earnings reduced to $1,600. He was able to find extra work as a visiting lecturer at the Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia for another $100 to $200 per year. But this hardly made up for the shortfall. Although his salary at Penn was later raised to $1,900, in transferring to Wheaton, Clarke felt justified in requesting an annual salary of $3,000. After negotiations, he accepted a salary of $2,750 a year, an increase surely welcome to Gordon and his wife, who by that point had a baby to care for. The new position at Wheaton brought Clarke some much desired recognition and respect. He had served as an instructor at Penn since 1924 while a graduate student. But despite graduating in 1929 and continuing to teach for a total of 12 years, he never received a promotion to assistant professor. He thought this lack of promotion was a disgrace and decided in 1937 that he would never again return to his alma mater unless it was accompanied by a promotion in rank. Clarke felt that his teaching, service, and publication record merited a promotion. But some administrators at Penn actively worked to block his promotion because they saw him as a troublemaker, on account of his membership in the reforming movement within the PCUSA. Of his detractors, Clark wrote, "There are two persons who dislike Dr. Henry Bradford Smith, a philosophy professor at Penn. The same two love me no more, and church affiliations lead one of them to wish for and work for, both in civil courts and in private, my embarrassment, whether financial, professional, or personal." When Clark asked his Penn philosophy professor colleague, Edgar A. Singer Jr., about his chances of getting a promotion if he returned, Singer relayed to Clark that their fellow colleague, Dr. Henry Bradford Smith, took up Clark's case with the dean and the vice provost, but that Smith's efforts had ended in failure. Dr. Singer wrote to Clark, "The attitude of the administration remained absolutely unchanged." Although also through Dr. Singer, Dr. Smith was obliged to relay a message from the administration. Advise Dr. Clark to remain where he is. That's sort of the last parting message from Pennsylvania after a dozen or more years there. Ultimately, it was Clark's dedication to opposing the modernists in the PCUSA that was his undoing at Penn. Dr. Singer alluded to this in his letter to Clark. "I suspect that if the reasons for not promoting or rehiring you were known to you, you would take the deepest of them to be an honor to you." In an earlier letter, Singer had lamented the future of Penn's philosophy department should Clark decide to leave. He wrote, "If you were not to come back, we should be utterly up a stump in the matter of finding any successor, even halfway acceptable to the department, as continuing a tradition of sound scholarship in the field you cultivate." Looking back, we can see 1936 and 1937 as crucial years for Clark. Soon after Clark was hired at Wheaton, the reform efforts in the PCUSA hit their terminus. Machen and Buswell, along with other members of the independent board of Presbyterian Foreign Missions, were suspended from ministry. Clark followed these men out of the PCUSA and became a founding member of the Presbyterian Church of America. Buswell became Clark's closest confidant at Wheaton. With a shared background in Presbyterian and Calvinist theology, the two were in a minority on the campus, dominated by an interdenominational evangelical Christianity. For part of Clark's first year at Wheaton, he and Buswell were both members of the Presbyterian Church of America. Buswell, however, left the denomination after the Third General Assembly of June 1st, 1937, which voted against his demand that the entire denomination officially renounce the use of alcohol. Buswell soon thereafter joined the group of ministers which formed the Bible Presbyterian Church. However, since the split was not over fundamental doctrines such as the inerrancy of Scripture, the issue that caused the PCA to break away from the PCUSA, it did not produce an impassable divide between Clark and Buswell, who remained united on much of their Calvinist and Presbyterian theology. Now look at the intellectual honor roll. When Clark joined the faculty, Wheaton College was experiencing a period of rapid growth. In this era, Wheaton had a strong reputation for both its Christian environment and its academic prowess, later even being referred to as a fundamentalist Harvard. During Clark's years at the college, Wheaton was a fountainhead for many noteworthy future church leaders. Indeed, a list of Clark's students reads like an honor roll of 20th century Christian intellectuals. His students included Edward Carnell, Edmund Clowney, Lars Grandberg, Carl F. H. Henry, Paul Jewett, and Harold Lindsell. Even Billy Graham studied at Wheaton and enrolled in Clark's medieval philosophy course. Believing that formal logic was essential for understanding Christian faith, Clark spent much time teaching the subject. Yet some of his students saw his emphasis on logic to be detrimental to their desired warm evangelism. In other words, many students were looking for an emotional, not an intellectual appeal to the faith. Samuel D. Faircloth witnessed this struggle between Clark and his students firsthand. Faircloth was a student in Clark's medieval philosophy class alongside a young Billy Graham. According to Faircloth, Graham objected to Clarke's strictly logical and rational approach to Christianity. In an interview in 2010, Faircloth recalled, I was trying to catch up historically and every other way with the prof. He knew what he was talking about. He was a top drawer teacher. Billy was in the background. He stood up one day and looked Clarke right in the eye. I'll never forget this because I thought he had a lot of nerve. He stood up and pointed his finger at Clarke. Doc, you're cold. And Clarke looked right back. I prefer to remain cold. Clarke was a good philosophy professor, and Graham was not operating on that level. He was operating on a warm evangelistic level, and Clarke was talking about Augustine's City of God. In short, Clarke was not Billy Graham, an evangelist of popular broad appeal. While students like Graham may have objected to this approach, Clarke's cold logic was a corollary principle of his main axiom or first principle, the truth of the Bible. As Clarke was fond of pointing out, if one is to think or speak at all, he must abide by the laws of logic. Clarke's detractors often called him a rationalist, one who presupposes bare logic itself as its main principle. Yet logic was not the starting point for Clarke. Rather, it was a tool of the trade, supported within Scripture itself by the Logos doctrine of John's Gospel. Clarke elaborated upon this doctrine in his 1972 book, The Johannine Logos, in which he explained how the Greek word logos in the Bible often signifies the logical or rational principle of thought which enlightens all men. Clarke's approach to grading was equally cold, with the intention of instilling in his students the habits of scholars. He believed the overriding purpose of college was study, and studying was necessary even for the top students who took his courses. The difficulty of his quizzes, he refused to call them tests, was recalled by one of his former students, Dr. Carl F.H. Henry. Clarke gave us periodic true, false, or completion tests of 20 questions, and never scaled the grades on the basis of 100. It was a routine comment that not even the Pope could fare better than 20 points on Clarke's exams, and he would be lucky to get that. Though Clarke's approach was unattractive to some students, there were others at Wheaton who appreciated his coldness. Ironically, one such student was Ruth Bell, who later married the warm evangelist Billy Graham. In her book, It's My Turn, she recounted a time when she was experiencing doubt of her Christian faith. A fellow student suggested she see a particular professor who was known to be spiritual, but Ruth objected, saying, he will talk with me and pray with me, and it could even get a little emotional. I don't want that. All I want are cold, hard facts. She continued, I wanted to see Dr. Gordon Clarke. Known for his logic, his unemotional brilliance, I felt he would give me nothing but the cold, hard facts. Although Clarke certainly hoped his students would ultimately come to adopt the Christian and Reformed positions he embraced, he did not teach his Christian beliefs alone to the exclusion of all other thought. In fact, he was known to employ the Socratic Method. That is, he repeatedly questioned his students, forcing them to think through the logical steps of their own beliefs. Carl F.H. Henry later wrote about Clarke's teaching. When he taught Augustine or Aquinas or Spinoza, he was for a time the living incarnation of each thinker, defending a given philosopher's affirmations against all counterattack, and driving us to formulate our criticisms ever more lucidly and logically. This teaching style of Clarke shows that he was not solely a zealous Christian, but truly an academic. Clarke's work at Wheaton went beyond the classroom. He formed and led a college chess club. He gave a number of speeches, including at least one to the French club about his time studying at the Sorbonne. In many cases, the relationships he had with his students became lasting friendships. In at least 3 cases, Clarke attended the weddings of Wheaton students. The first of these, in the summer of 1940, was the wedding of John and Miriam Lee in California, where Clarke's daughter Lois, then 4 years of age, was the flower girl. Prior to this occasion, in fact, Clarke had never owned a car. He asked his students to locate a car for him, which he then purchased for the trip. Another wedding Clark attended was that of Edward Carnell in 1944. In 1945, it appears that he officiated the wedding of James Tompkins and Charlotte Boggs. Other students, including Howard Long and Warren and Norma Davis, visited the Clark household in later years, and Clark in turn visited the Davises in Arizona, where they worked as missionaries translating the Bible into Navajo when he was on road trips out west in later years. Take a slight break there, half an hour in. I think we'll see if we can get this chapter read, maybe in one go. Being early in the morning here, I don't have anyone viewing right now, but I don't have very many YouTube subscribers. I probably subscribe to more things than I have subscribers. Maybe I have one watching. My big fan. So we'll continue. A new section. A new president. Clark lost his main ally at Wheaton when Boswell was fired in January of 1940, after Boswell refused the request of the Board of Trustees for him to resign. Though this was denied by at least one board member, Boswell had likely upset them through his advocacy of the separationist movements in the Presbyterian Church. The board may have felt Boswell's stand brought too much negative attention to Wheaton and highlighted dissension in the Christian world. While Boswell's outspoken support of separationism likely contributed to his dismissal, this was not the only issue. One member of the Board of Trustees wrote that the reason for the difficulty with Boswell was due to repeated instances of friction with those in the administration immediately under him, and that he lacked the gift of reconciling himself to the disagreements which others may have with him. At the same time, there were complaints to the fact that Boswell had hired a Wheaton outsider to coach the college's football team. Whatever the exact cause of Boswell's dismissal, Clark lost not only a fellow proponent of Calvinism on the campus, but also a defender of his teaching and the proximity of a good friend. Boswell had defended Clark not only on the Wheaton campus, but also within the Bible Presbyterian Church. Despite Boswell's departure, he and Clark remained in contact for many years. Boswell continued to be proud of his own actions at Wheaton, even writing ex-president in the salutation of his letters from his new job as a professor at Faith Seminary. I want to look at the footnote here when it says that he defended Clark in the Bible Presbyterian Church. Looks like I have that from a letter of Dr. Clark's to Robert Strong, where he said, "And I know too how Boswell defended me when some of the Bible Synod protested to him about keeping me at Wheaton." So that's interesting. Don't know anything else about that. But I do know, I don't think I talk about this in the book much, that they were looking at starting a seminary there at Wheaton College, possibly related to the Bible Presbyterians, Boswell, Clark, even Thiessen, and others. And this would have either been, maybe Faith Seminary would move there, or maybe it would be another seminary, but it didn't really gain much ground, much traction. With Boswell's departure, Clark lost a defender of his Calvinist views. Swiftly enough, his dedication to a logical, intellectual, and Calvinist Christianity brought conflict with the new administration, despite his influence and generally favorable reputation among the students. The main conflict between Clark and the college arose when the New Testament professor and head of the Bible and Philosophy department, Dr. Henry C. Thiessen, expressed displeasure with some of Clark's views. Thiessen had been opposed to Clark's presence at the college from the start, but his complaints fell on deaf ears during the Boswell administration. The new president, V. Raymond Edman, was more sympathetic to Thiessen's grievances. This was to be expected since Edman, who was an inside candidate for the presidency at Wheaton, had, like Thiessen, strong connections to the college's core theological values. Prior to his presidency, Edman had been a missionary to the Quechua people in Ecuador, and after finishing his doctoral degree, was a history professor at Wheaton from 1936 to 1940. Edman was well loved at the college and popular among the students, but he was no intellectual equal to Boswell or Clark. Edman, as a former missionary, took Thiessen's concerns seriously, If Clarke's Calvinism was harming evangelistic zeal, Edmund would certainly want to get to the bottom of it. Clarke was never one for towing a moderate line or hiding his views. So when Thiessen wanted him removed, Clarke's actions provided plenty of reasons for Edmund to follow up on Thiessen's concerns. For example, Clarke taught his students of the novelty or recentness of the dispensationalist view popular at Wheaton, that it originated in just the previous century and was unknown amongst the leaders of the Reformation. Clarke also visibly promoted Reformed theology on the campus. For example, to spur students to think about Reformed doctrine, he instituted a $50 prize for the student who could write the best historical short story on the Reformation or the Reformed faith. In addition, he formed a creed club, which met on Sunday afternoons to study the Westminster Confession of Faith, the historic confession of most Presbyterian churches. Though this club, which at least once had an attendance of 24 students, or through this club and his classes, Clarke's influence led many students to attend Westminster Theological Seminary after graduating from Wheaton College. In fact, Clarke was so effective at directing students to Westminster Seminary that a faith seminary student, Francis Schaeffer, who later became a popular author and apologist, complained in a letter, April 21, 1938, to Wheaton President J. Oliver Buswell, that students were choosing the OPC-favored Westminster Theological Seminary due to Clarke's influence, rather than the BPC's faith seminary as Schaeffer preferred. Clarke, therefore, influenced not only the many students who took his classes, but also a great part of the intellectual structure of the Presbyterian Church across denominational lines. Now we look at conflict with the administration. As Clarke's popularity and influence grew, he became an increasing threat to the status quo and to the administration at Wheaton. Complaints arose that Clarke's teaching was causing students to abandon evangelism and that his strong Calvinism constituted fatalism, which of course has been the complaint since the beginning, and it's not a valid one either, as we know Calvinists have done plenty of evangelistic work. Wheaton was officially non-denominational, but many of its administrators and professors were decidedly Arminian in theology. That is, they consciously followed the views of the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius in their soteriology, believing man has free will sufficient to choose or reject God for salvation. Clarke, in contrast, was Calvinist in his soteriology, holding that God is in sovereign control over all things, including man's will and eternal state. In some ways, President Edmund inherited a problem not of his own making. Clarke had made his views known when Wheaton College was in the process of hiring him in 1937. In fact, Buswell even knew of Clarke's views a year prior to Clarke's hire, as indicated in a number of letters between the two men. In the hiring process itself, Clarke's statement of faith specified the differences between his positions and the Wheaton College statement of faith and doctrinal platform. Specifically, Clarke affirmed that he was a Calvinist of the supralapsarian type and said, "I realize that this is not the most popular position, but I find it most consistent and most in accord with the Word of God." In addition, in his statement of faith, Clarke would not commit initially to the premillennial position of the college, affirming instead the traditional Calvinist position, and adding that he was not sure if he was postmillenarian or amillenarian. An official complaint against Clarke was lodged on January 11, 1942, when Professor Thiessen wrote to the Board of Trustees of Wheaton College, urging them to condemn his colleague. In view of Dr. Clarke's extreme theological position, this is Thiessen writing, and its harmful effects on students as evidenced over the years, and his insistence on the figurative interpretation of Joshua's long day, I therefore, by the way, I have no more knowledge about that, why Clarke here is said to want a figurative interpretation of Joshua's long day. I don't know any other spot where Clarke says that. As chairman of the Department of Bible, Theology, and Philosophy, I do hereby request that Dr. Clarke be no longer retained on the faculty of Wheaton College. Thiessen goes right for the jugular. Throughout the ordeal that ensued, Clarke looked to the teachings of the Westminster Confession of Faith both for guidance and as a shield of defense against the accusation that something was fundamentally flawed with his views. Clark wrote to Edwin Ryan, president of the Board of Trustees at Westminster Theological Seminary, saying, "I have tried to limit myself to the Westminster Confession, and the result is that I am considered extreme." That Thiessen's complaint did not lead to Clark's immediate dismissal reflects perhaps on the considerate, cautious, or even sympathetic views of Edmund, but resistance to Clark was mounting. Thiessen, as the head of the Bible and philosophy department, eliminated the college's philosophy major, an attempt to force Clark to leave the college on his own accord. Clark believed the elimination of the philosophy major was a terrible insult to him, committed, in his words, without departmental recommendation, committee action, or faculty approval. Edmund followed suit of Thiessen, prohibiting Clark from teaching Reformed Calvinist theology altogether. In short, to avoid drawing more attention to Clark and his threatening views, Thiessen and Edmund hoped to muzzle him in the areas he could have the most influence. 7 more pages. At the same time that the philosophy major was dropped from the catalog, the college also dropped the Greek and Latin majors, claiming that the decision in all 3 cases was due to financial considerations stemming from declining enrollment in these majors. With the removal of multiple majors, the administration contended that the loss of the philosophy major was not an attack aimed at Clark. For a time, with fewer Greek professors, Clark taught an elementary Greek course, arguing all the while that he could handle the course, in addition to the full curriculum necessary to retain the philosophy major. With Thiessen's complaint lodged and rumors of declining enrollment in the philosophy major, the validity of which Clark disputed, inasmuch as there were 20 students majoring in philosophy, but only 1 or 2 students in some other majors which were not dropped from the catalog. President Edmund was placed in a difficult position. Clark was not wholly innocent of the charges of negatively affecting the evangelistic zeal of the students. Clark was known for having his students critique chapel sermons by finding logical fallacies, which did not sit well with the administration, nor contribute to the general peace of the campus. With his hands effectively tied by the Wheaton leadership, Clark began to seek other options for employment. On May 1st, 1942, he wrote to his old friend Boswell, saying that he was considering resigning from Wheaton. In Clark's opinion, he could not teach if he had to stay silent on matters regarding his specific theological views. He confided to Boswell, "One cannot submit to such an underhanded procedure and retain self-respect." Also on May 1st, 1942, Clark wrote to an OPC colleague, Bert Goddard, and expressed similar frustrations. "To be brief, I am considering resigning, though 1 or 2 of the faculty who know me a little more intimately than the rest say not to. But it seems that my days are numbered no matter what." As the controversy over Clark's teaching spread, supporters of Clark came to his defense. Many observers thought the actions of the board were aimed specifically at Clark's theological views, rather than being for the good of the students, as the board professed. On June 1st, 1942, President Edmund received a letter from Gloria Grove, a recent alumna of the class of 1941. She wrote, "I've learned that the reason for the omission of the philosophy major and the reduction in the number of courses offered in philosophy is Dr. Thiessen's objection to Dr. Clark's theology. This was not altogether a surprise to me, since I have a vivid memory of the insults heaped upon Calvinism and Calvinists by Dr. Thiessen in his systematic theology lectures. In fact," well, that's the end of Grove. "In fact, Clark was not the first Wheaton professor to run into conflict with Thiessen." In response to Thiessen's attack, Clark reminded one of the trustees that last year Dr. Hoffman was dismissed from the college. "I gather that the chief cause of his dismissal was theological disagreement with Dr. Thiessen." This Dr. Hoffman was Dr. Jacob Hoffman, a conservative Methodist minister, whom J. Oliver Boswell knew from his days studying at the University of Chicago, and who had been brought out of retirement to teach Hebrew and Old Testament at Wheaton. Whereas Hoffman was an Arminian in theology, Thiessen held to a mediating view between Arminianism and Calvinism. Thus, Thiessen had disagreements with both ends of the spectrum. Clark wrote of the situation, "Now, Dr. Hoffman was an Arminian. I am a Calvinist. Dr. Thiessen is neither. He has a system of his own, never adopted by any denomination so far as I know. And further, Clark argued, Dr. Thiessen's theology has never been adopted by any denomination and is only his personal production. Thus, with Thiessen at odds with both opposing soteriological systems, Clark argued that if the trustees wish to enforce the views of Dr. Thiessen, that will settle the matter, but it will result in a Wheaton purged of Calvinists and Arminians alike. Meanwhile, repeated requests from Clark to Edmund led to a faculty vote on the restoration of the philosophy major at the last faculty meeting of the year in June 1942. The vote passed, and the philosophy major was back in the catalog for the following year. Suspicious of Clark's theology, President Edmund launched an inquiry into the effect of Clark's teaching. Edmund wrote to Carl F. H. Henry, a former student of Clark's, saying, "Some questions have been raised in various quarters about the import and influence of Dr. Clark's teaching. Inasmuch as you majored in philosophy, you should be in a position to make a fair and frank evaluation from your point of view." Edmund also wrote to John E. Woods, another recent graduate and then student at Princeton. Although Woods had disagreed with Clark's theological positions on a variety of grounds, he responded to Edmund with a positive appraisal of Clark's teaching methods and noted that Clark was a scholar and a gentleman in their theological discussions. Woods praised Edmund for getting to the bottom of the whole affair and learning the truth prior to making a decision one way or the other. Woods concluded, however, by noting, "I should personally consider it an irreparable loss to the college if Dr. Clark were permitted to leave the Wheaton faculty." Thiessen, however, would not back down. On June 24, 1942, he again wrote to the Board of Trustees asking for Clark's resignation. This time, he provided 6 specific reasons why Clark should be removed. According to Thiessen, Clark taught the following 5 things. God causes everything, including evil. The doctrine of double predestination. The doctrine of limited atonement. That God's emotions are anthropomorphic, which is a mistake. That should be anthropopathic. But anyways, the figurative interpretation of Joshua's long day. Thiessen's 6th reason, not enumerated as were the first 5, for requesting Clark's resignation was concern that Clark's teaching tended toward absolute determinism. In response to Thiessen's claims, President Edmund and a special committee on the Board of Trustees held a meeting on June 30, 1942. Dr. Clark was invited to attend. This special committee consisted of thoroughgoing fundamentalists who generally echoed the theological positions of the college. Board members included the so-called Archbishop of Fundamentalism, Dr. Harry A. Ironside, a popularizer of dispensation. Another man is a popularizer of dispensationalism and pastor of Chicago's Moody Memorial Church. That is Ironside. And then David Otis Fuller, a pastor of the well-known Wealthy Street Baptist Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and an early proponent of the exclusive use of the King James Version of the Bible. Then Herman A. Fisher Jr., a grandson of the former college president Jonathan Blanchard, and Dr. William McCarroll, pastor of Cicero Bible Church and founder of the Independent Fundamentalist Churches of America, and Mr. Robert E. Nicholas, a wealthy local businessman and major donor to the college. According to a report from the committee, they conferred with Clark at length about the questions that had arisen, and particularly as to his personal belief in theological areas. Although admitting that Clark's beliefs for the most part did not differ from their own, the special committee concluded that he holds certain views originating with John Calvin or imitators of Calvin, which go beyond what we could endorse. Ultimately, some of the committee felt that part of the error arises from an effort to expand by human reason and deduction the doctrine of the person of God beyond what is definitely taught in Scripture. Apparently not wanting to get into a debate, the committee further concluded that to attempt to directly refute such error similarly might be to presume by human wisdom to develop doctrines about God going beyond which he has seen fit to reveal to us. Although Clark held to these fundamentalists' core beliefs, he was not a fundamentalist of the same stripe. as those on the special committee of the Board of Trustees. In fact, Clark despised the anti-intellectualism associated with the fundamentalist movement. His commitment to the Westminster Confession of Faith led him to value teaching the whole counsel of God, not just a limited set of fundamental doctrines. Clark would later critique fundamentalists in general, saying, "In the 20th century, the fundamentalists, in varying degrees, advocate a faith without reason, and they stress Bible study more than the pietists and the anarchical prophets did. They frequently inveigh against philosophy and mere human reason. Even in doctrine, they do not ordinarily go beyond a half a dozen fundamental beliefs. Anything further is dry as dust theology." On August 21st, 1942, Clark clarified his views in a letter to President Edmund. Clark stated that he had repeatedly and explicitly informed the board that it was his belief that although God is the cause of all things, God is not the author of evil, nor is he guilty or responsible for sin. This, he argued, is because, unlike in the case of man, there is no power over God to which he can be held accountable. God, Clark believed, is not the author of sin because nothing God does is sinful. Clark sought support for his position in the Westminster Confession of Faith, which states that God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass, yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin. Westminster Confession, Chapter 3, Part 1. Regarding the charge that God lacks emotions, Clark equated emotions and passions with the passions denied in the Westminster Confession, which declares that God is without body, parts, or passions. That's in Chapter 2, Part 1. So we come then to Clark's resignation, the last couple pages here. On September 1st, 1942, Edmund and the special committee of the Board of Trustees sent 3 suggestions to the entire board regarding how Gordon Clark should teach. More censorship. 1, that to the largest extent possible, he confine his teaching to the stated subjects without advocating any theological beliefs which are controversial among Orthodox Christians. It's funny here that it says he rather than like all of us. it's just aimed at Clark. It's not something that needs to be pressed upon everyone, apparently. 2, that if asked his personal opinion as to the group of doctrines in question, he be frank, but state the belief rather than expound his reasons, being equally frank in admitting his susceptibility to error, and that his views in this respect have not been those of most Christian leaders. Again, just terrible. And 3, that he by no means endorses deductions from such doctrines, which have been made on such questions as personal responsibility for sin, the duty of missionary effort and evangelization, and the duty of seeking the guidance of the Spirit as to problems of both conduct and doctrine. Of course, in the confession, we see that we allow good and necessary consequence from Scripture. The suggestions were a call to Clark to avoid his distinctive teachings. When he would not comply, the Board of Trustees voted unanimously on December 22, 1942, to end his tenure after the 1942-43 school year. Clark learned about the vote when President Edmund brought him in for a personal conference. Edmund explained the situation to a stunned Clark, to whom he then offered an opportunity to resign. At this point, Clark had not been officially removed, but he was effectively prohibited from teaching his own views. The action of denying Clark's tenure was made official in February 1943, but was not set to take effect until the end of the school year, allowing him to finish his courses for the semester. Clark had previously sought the advice of his lawyer and high school friend, John Harper, asking whether he should resign or file a lawsuit against the college for breach of contract. Harper informed him that he likely did not have a winnable case, since employment is at will and may be terminated by either party at any time and without notice. In other words, if the board decided not to renew a professor's contract, a professor had no recourse. Harper recommended that Clark back away peacefully, start looking for another position, and do nothing that might harm his reputation or chances somewhere else. Following this advice, on February 15, 1943, Clark sent his letter of resignation to President Edmund and the Board of Trustees of the college. Shortly thereafter, the board accepted Clark's resignation. On March 25, 1943, the Presbyterian Guardian, the semi-monthly publication commonly associated with the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, published Clark's letter of resignation. In it, Clark enumerated 5 points on the grounds of religious and moral conviction for his resignation. These reasons can best be summed up in his final point. To comply with these conditions would be to repudiate my vows of ordination to the eldership. Clark's adherence as a ruling elder in the church to his denomination's confessional standards, the Westminster Confession and catechisms, was thus shown to be stronger than his commitment to Wheaton College. A firestorm of letters of disapproval inundated President Edmund's mailbox. Supporters of Clark who wrote to Edmund included Floyd Hamilton, A.C. Gordon, Leroy B. Oliver, Willard Wellman, Everett Hawks, Robert Graham, and Elwyn M. Sire. In addition to these letters of protest, Dr. Albert S. O'Brien, a chemistry professor at Wheaton, who had been involved in Clark's Creed Club, felt the college was putting a restraint on the liberty of teaching and resigned in protest. O'Brien specified his reason in the Presbyterian Guardian, saying, "After various serious consideration, I have decided to resign my position at Wheaton. The religious and academic issues involved in Dr. Clark's removal from the faculty are the reason for my taking this action." The fallout continued when the Presbyterian Guardian printed an article titled Wheaton College Today. Its author, Edwin H. Ryan, criticized Wheaton for its inconsistency in once accepting Clark's views when hiring him and later dismissing him for holding the very same positions. Ryan argued, furthermore, that Wheaton set itself against practically every Reformed and Presbyterian church body in the world by its actions opposing Clark's Calvinism. Clark's supporters did not go away quietly, and the college's reputation in the Reformed world suffered. When a student at Wheaton informed Clark that he had found mailed OPC tracts in the trash, Clark notified Floyd Hamilton, a missionary who had sent the tracts on behalf of the OPC's Christian Education Committee. Hamilton sent a letter to the postal inspector. President Edmund then received an inquiry and visit from the postal inspector from Chicago. Edmund assured the inspector that the tracts were not thrown out intentionally, and thus insufficient evidence was found to further the complaint. Throughout the debacle, Edmund found himself in a difficult position. The complaints against Clark had not originated from him, and yet he had to make some difficult decisions about Clark's future at the college. Edmund wrote, "The whole matter has been a great grief to me. I have sought to save Dr. Clark for Wheaton and the great influence he can be for evangelical Christianity throughout the world." Edmund had been sympathetic to Clark's plight. To evidence this, it should be noted that Clark wrote to a friend that at an administration meeting, Thiessen tried to make another speech against me, but Edmund just shut him up. After the school year was over, Clark stayed in the Wheaton area and became the Orthodox Presbyterian Church's student advisor for the 1943-43 school year, for the continuing witness of historic Presbyterianism on the campus. In this role, he invited students to his home for Bible studies and classes. Clark's resignation from Wheaton was a low point in his life. Nevertheless, he remained optimistic and continued to pursue the call to preach the gospel, writing in his notes on this occasion, 2 Timothy 4:2, "Preach the gospel in season and out of season. This may be out of season, but I shall continue to preach under the auspices of the Home Missions Committee of the OPC." The events at Wheaton taught Clark that his Calvinist views would not be accepted at the ostensibly interdenominational Christian institution. It appears, in this case at least, that the trustees of Wheaton were more concerned with appealing to their supporters than in defining or defending true theological beliefs. It seemed obvious to Clark that Clark was more likely to be welcomed at an institution committed to the Westminster Confession of Faith. So what I kind of struck me in rereading that again, and what I was trying to emphasize there, is that at that period, it seems for the most part that Clark was very much seen as your normal Calvinist, we'll see in the next chapter that there's these undercurrents of, okay, Clark is teaching and saying some things different, at least certainly different than the Dutch um, led men there at Westminster. And I mean, I think all of us, even those who like Dr. Clark, will agree that Clark is saying some things different than even the traditional Presbyterian views, in that his views are often perhaps more philosophical. Um, in my view, really, they're more well thought out, and he really gets to the heart of the matter on a lot of subjects. And most of what Clark says really has been said, particularly by Calvin and other theologians in the past. And very often, I think in his time and in ours, it's for lack of people being well read that they haven't heard some of these things. Like there was a slight reference there to supralapsarianism, and if people don't know about that position or are uncomfortable with Clark's, it's for lack of being read on the subject. And even his particular view of teleological supralapsarianism is itself, again, not novel, that it has precedent. And this is where I think there's so much to like in the Protestant Reformed churches in America, that they are supralapsarians of that type, as was Herman Hoeksema, and that they are always aggressively pursuing the truth. Whereas as you see here in the Wheaton College episode, and I think so much of American fundamentalism, there's a running away from the truth that occurs in many times and places. So we see in Dr. Clark someone who's running into the truth rather than running away from it. And certainly he makes mistakes, as we all do, but he is pursuing that truth. And that's what originally interested me in his work, as the biggest question to me was and continues to be that question, the biblical question, what is truth? And that we have an answer in the Bible, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Um, and well, there's much more to say about that, but it's not a sermon here. So I wish you all well, and I hope you enjoyed this recording. We'll try to keep going on here, hopefully every month or two. Otherwise, I'll never get done with the book. But wanted to do this for historical reasons as well, that we have this recording. So God bless and good day.